In 2019, he was more than just a fighter, he was a cultural phenomenon. A man who didn't just win fights, but dismantled legacies with the grace of a high fashion model and the lethal precision of a grandmaster. They called him the Last Stylebender, and for nearly half a decade he carried an aura of invincibility that felt woven into the very fabric of the UFC. He was the undisputed god of the middleweight division, a king who didn't just sit on the throne, he danced on it. But fast forward to today, and that aura, it hasn't just faded, it's been systematically dismantled. In the video today, we explore the meteoric rise and the sudden violent collapse of one of MMA's most dominant dynasties. We're looking at the fight that ended Israel, Adesanya's aura. How did the most technically gifted strikers of his generation fall so far, so fast? Was it a single punch from a wild underdog, a fundamental shift in the sport's evolution, or the slow crushing weight of his own massive ego? Today, we peel back the layers of a downfall that redefined the middleweight landscape forever. To truly understand the collapse of the Stylebender, we have to go back to the mud. It didn't start in $1 million octagon in Las Vegas. It started in the lonely hallways of a high school in Wanganui, New Zealand. Imagine being a skinny Nigerian kid, recently moved to a predominantly white town where the only thing people care about is rugby and toughness. Israel was the ultimate outsider. He was obsessed with anime, he loved to dance, and he had a personality that was too big for the small box the world tried to put him in. Israel wasn't just a stranger, he was a target. He's spoken at length about the vicious, racist bullying he endured during those formative years. The names, the isolation, the physical threats. It was a crucible that would have broken most people. But Israel Mobology, Odunayo, Adesanya wasn't people. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to dominate. He found kickboxing at the age of 18, not because he loved violence, but because he needed a way to reclaim his power. He needed a weapon to fight back against a world that told him he didn't belong. His father once gave him a piece of advice that would become the foundation of his career. You are only a man when you have nothing left to lose. In those early days, Israel had absolutely nothing. He wasn't fighting for money or fame. He was fighting for the respect he was denied as a child. Every flashy knockout in the Chinese kickboxing circuit, every arrogant post-fight celebration was a direct message to those bullies in Wanganui. That trauma was his jet fuel. It made him sharper than anyone else. It made him hungrier than anyone else. But here's the thing about fuel. If you don't find a new source once you've reached the top, the tank eventually runs dry. This period of his life is critical to understanding his later aura. The arrogance people saw in the UFC wasn't just confidence, it was a shield. It was a persona built to ensure that no one would ever be able to look down on him again. When he entered the UFC, he wasn't just trying to win a belt, he was trying to prove to that kid in Wanganui that he was the greatest to ever live. This psychological drive is what made him so dangerous, and it's also what made the eventual fall so much more devastating. When the aura of being the greatest started to slip, the shield he had built for decades began to crumble. This deep-seated need for validation, born from early trauma, became both his greatest strength and ultimately his most profound weakness. It fueled his ascent but blinded him to the subtle shifts that would eventually lead to his undoing. He built an empire on the back of this primal fire, but forgot that even the most magnificent structures require constant maintenance and adaptation. By 2021, Israel Adesanya had transcended the sport. He was no longer just a middleweight champion, He was a global icon. He was sitting front row at Paris Fashion Week, signing multi-million-dollar deals with Puma, and commanding a social media following that rivaled mainstream celebrities. He had cleared out the division not once, but twice. Robert Whittaker, Yoel Romero, Paulo Costa, Marvin Vettori, the who's who of the 185-pound division, had all been systematically picked apart by the Stylebender. This is where we enter the delusional peak. Success in combat sports is a slow-acting poison. It starts with the yes men. When you're at the top, your inner circle stops being your critics and starts being your fans. Your coaches are treated like infallible gurus, and your sparring partners are chosen not to beat you, but to help you look good. Israel began to refer to himself in the third person. He wasn't just training for a fight anymore. He was managing a brand. He was curating a legacy. The warning signs were screaming, but the world was too blinded by the hype to hear them. The Stylebender, who used to take daring risks, who used to hunt for the finish, was replaced by a champion who played it safe. He was point striking his way to 5-round decisions while the fans in the arena booed. But in Israel's mind, the fans just didn't understand the art. He believed his own legend so much that he thought he could win on aura alone. He stopped being the hunter and became the prize, a stationary target for a new generation of fighters who were studying his every move with predatory intent. This wasn't just complacency, it was a deep-seated belief in his own invincibility, a psychological barrier that prevented him from seeing the evolving threats around him. The constant praise, the lavish lifestyle, the adoration of millions, it all contributed to a distorted reality where his past successes overshadowed the need for future adaptation. He became a victim of his own narrative, trapped in the very aura he had so meticulously crafted. Think about the Paulo Costa fight. That was the peak of his aura. He made a world-class fighter look like a beginner and then humiliated him on global television. But that level of dominance is dangerous. It breeds a sense of untouchability. Israel started to believe that he was playing a different game than everyone else. He started to believe that he could simply will a victory into existence through manifestation and anime-inspired monologues. But in the cage, the only thing that matters is the cold, hard reality of leather hitting bone. The illusion of the God King was intoxicating, not just for him, but for his entire team, creating an echo chamber where critical self-assessment was replaced by unwavering belief in his inherent superiority. This hubris, while initially a source of strength, ultimately became the crack in his armour, a vulnerability that would be brutally exposed. September 10th, 2023, Sydney, Australia. This was supposed to be another easy night at the office for the King. Sean Strickland was a late replacement, a man most analysts dismissed as a joke, who only got the title shot because Dricus du Plessis was injured. But while Israel was busy manifesting another highlight reel victory, Strickland and his team at Extreme Couture had done the unthinkable. They had cracked the code. They had solved the most complex puzzle in MMA. This wasn't just a loss, it was a systemic failure of the entire city kickboxing machine. For years, Israel's defense relied on his reads, his superhuman ability to see a strike coming and lean back just far enough to let it graze his skin. But Sean Strickland didn't fight like a traditional kickboxer. He used a modified Philly shell, marching forward with an awkward upright stance that completely neutralised Israel's range. As Strickland's coach Eric Nixick later revealed, they were calling out Israel's setups in real time from the corner. When Israel tried to drop into southpaw to set up his signature head kick, Nixick's voice cut through the noise. He's going to same side head kick you. And Strickland was already there, his guard high, his eyes locked on the target. This level of tactical preparation from Strickland's corner was a stark contrast to Adesanya's seemingly relaxed approach, highlighting a fundamental difference in their mental states entering the fight. Strickland fought like he had everything to gain. Adesanya fought like he had nothing to lose. But in reality, he had everything to lose. The sport had evolved, but the champion had stayed still. He was stuck in the mud, as Nixick famously put it. His calf kicks, once his most potent weapon, were checked with painful precision. His feints, which used to freeze opponents in fear, were ignored by a man who simply didn't care about the aura. For 25 minutes, the man who was supposed to be the greatest striker in the history of the sport looked like a bewildered amateur. The aura didn't just crack that night. It was shattered into a million pieces on the canvas of the Kudos Bank Arena. The sheer dominance of Strickland was not just physical, it was psychological. He broke Adesanya's spirit, forcing him to fight a fight he didn't want to fight in a style he wasn't accustomed to. This wasn't a lucky punch, it was a masterclass in nullification, a blueprint for how to defeat a seemingly invincible champion. What made this night so significant wasn't just the result, it was the way it happened. Strickland didn't land a lucky punch, he didn't win a controversial decision. He dominated every single minute of the fight. He made the Stylebender look ordinary. He showed the world that the god could bleed, and once that realization set in, the aura was gone forever. Every fighter in the division saw that fight and thought the same thing. If Sean Strickland can do it, so can I. This was the moment the middleweight division collectively exhaled, realizing that the boogeyman was no longer lurking in the shadows, but had been exposed in the harsh glare of the octagon lights. The psychological impact of this fight reverberated throughout the entire sport, signalling a shift in the landscape and opening the door for new contenders who previously felt intimidated by Adesanya's mystique. Let's get technical for a moment. In his prime, Israel, Adesanya's defensive metrics were staggering. He was landing over 50% of his significant strikes while avoiding nearly 65% of everything thrown at him. His head movement was fluid, his footwork impeccable, allowing him to slip punches by mere inches and counter with devastating precision. But the data shows a sharp decline beginning with his first fight against Alex Pereira in the UFC. His reaction time, once measured in milliseconds, began to slow. In the Strickland fight, his significant strike accuracy plummeted to a career low 34%. He wasn't just missing, he was being outthought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately outfought. The subtle nuances of his striking, once his greatest asset, became predictable tells for his opponents. The calf kick meta that Israel helped popularise also turned against him. For years he used the low kick to chop down his opponent's foundations, limiting their mobility and setting up his powerful head strikes. But fighters like Strickland and Duplessis stopped fearing the kick and started using it as a timing trigger. They realised that when Israel threw the kick, he was momentarily vulnerable to a straight counter. They stopped playing the kickboxing game and started playing the MMA game. Israel was still trying to win a chess match, while his opponents were turning it into a street fight, adapting their strategies to exploit his now identifiable patterns. This inability to evolve his own game, to add new layers to his already complex striking, proved to be a fatal flaw in an ever-progressing sport. The tools that once made him unique were now being used against him. A bitter irony for the Last Stylebender. We also have to talk about the physical toll. Israel was one of the most active champions in UFC history. He fought 4 times in a single year during his peak, defending his title against a murderer's row of contenders. That level of activity is great for your bank account. and your legacy, but it's devastating for your central nervous system. By the time he faced Strickland, he had spent over 150 minutes in the octagon against the best fighters in the world, absorbing countless blows and enduring the brutal grind of championship training camps. The mileage wasn't just in his joints, it was in his brain. His ability to make those split-second reads, to react to incoming strikes, was simply wearing out. The cumulative effect of years of high-level competition had finally caught up to him, manifesting as a subtle but critical degradation of his physical and mental faculties. This wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of the attributes that made him extraordinary. Why did this happen? In the fight game, we often talk about mileage, the physical toll of hundreds of rounds of sparring and dozens of professional fights. But for Israel, the damage was more psychological than physical. It was the crushing weight of the crown. When you spend 5 years being told you are a god, you lose the ability to be a student. You stop asking, how can I get better? And start asking, how can I stay here? The relentless pressure to maintain an undefeated image, to constantly innovate and entertain, became an unbearable burden. This psychological fatigue, often unseen by the public, can be far more debilitating than any physical injury, slowly eroding a fighter's will and desire to compete at the highest level. His rivalry with Alex Pereira played a massive role in this psychological decline. Pereira was the monster under Israel's bed, the man who had beaten him twice in kickboxing and followed him to the UFC to take his belt. When Israel finally knocked Pereira out in their rematch, it was his greatest triumph, but it might also have been his undoing. Once he conquered his ultimate demon, Israel seemed to lose his why. Without a monster to hunt, he became the monster that everyone else was hunting. The intense emotional investment in that rivalry, the sheer relief and catharsis of finally defeating Pereira, left a void that no other challenge seemed to fill. The fire that had driven him since childhood, the need to prove himself, had been extinguished by the very victory he craved. He had reached the summit, but found himself alone, without a new mountain to climb. His yes men didn't tell him he was getting predictable. They didn't tell him the division had caught up to his style. They just kept polishing the throne while the foundation of the castle was crumbling into the sea. This is the tragedy of the fallen fighter. The very thing that makes you great, your unwavering self-belief, is often the very thing that leads to your downfall. You become so convinced of your own greatness that you stop seeing the threats until it's too late. The isolation of being at the top, surrounded by sycophants rather than honest critics, created a dangerous echo chamber. He lost touch with the ground realities of the sport, believing his own hype to such an extent that he failed to recognise the hungry wolves circling his throne. This psychological blind spot, cultivated by years of unchallenged dominance, proved to be his ultimate undoing, a silent killer far more insidious than any old punch or kick. Many fans and pundits tried to claim that the Strickland fight was a fluke, a bad night at the office, or a case of underestimating an opponent. But the downfall of a king is rarely a single isolated event. It's a sequence of failures. After a much-needed hiatus, Israel returned at UFC 305 to face his bitter rival, Dricus du Plessis. This was supposed to be the redemption arc, the return of the real Stylebender. But the man who stepped into that cage in Perth was a ghost of his former self. He looked hesitant, his movements lacked conviction, and the signature swagger was replaced by a palpable sense of doubt. The fight, which was meant to re-establish his dominance, only served to further cement the narrative of his decline. He looked human. He looked vulnerable. The fluidity that once made him look like he was moving in slow motion was gone. When du Plessis dragged him to the ground and locked in a rear naked choke, The world watched in shock as the man who was once untouchable tapped out. It was the first time Israel had ever been submitted in his MMA career, a humiliating end to a fight that showcased his glaring weaknesses. The boogeyman was officially dead, and the middleweight division breathed a collective sigh of relief. This submission loss wasn't just a defeat, it was a symbolic surrender of his perceived invincibility, a moment that irrevocably altered his standing in the sport. It showed that not only could he be outstruck, but he could also be outgrappled, exposing some multifaceted vulnerability that few had ever dared to imagine. And the final nail in the coffin came in February 2025 against Nassourdine Imavov, a fight that just 3 years prior would have been a mismatch, a showcase for Adesanya's brilliance. But that night, Israel looked every bit of his 35 years. His reactions were a fraction of a second slower. His movement lacked the pop, the explosive burst that once defined his striking. He wasn't the Last Stylebender anymore. He was just another veteran trying to hold on to a dream that the world had already moved past. The fight was a stark reminder that time is the ultimate undefeated opponent, and even the greatest fighters eventually succumb to its relentless march. The one vibrant canvas of his career was now showing the cracks of age and wear, a poignant testament to the ephemeral nature of athletic greatness. So, we return to the final philosophical question. Does the violent end erase the years of absolute dominance? Or does the dominance justify the eventual, inevitable fall? Israel Adesanya will undeniably go down as one of the greatest middleweights to ever grace the octagon. His highlight reel is a masterpiece of combat sports art, a testament to his unparalleled skill and artistry. But his story is also a stark, haunting cautionary tale for the next generation, a reminder that even the most brilliant stars eventually burn out. The aura is gone. The Last Stylebender has been humanized, broken, and brought back down to earth. But perhaps in that humanity, there is a new kind of respect to be found. He didn't retire at the top. He stayed long enough to see himself become the villain, and then eventually just another man in a pair of 4-ounce gloves. This willingness to face defeat, to continue fighting even when his powers waned, speaks to a different kind of courage, a raw honesty that transcends the manufactured mystique. It's a testament to the brutal honesty of the sport, where every fighter, no matter how great, and eventually faces their own mortality in the cage. Was he ever truly as invincible as we believed? Or were we all just participants in a collective delusion fueled by his undeniable charisma? That's for you to decide. The legacy of Israel. Adesanya is complex, a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, brilliance and hubris. He was a pioneer, an artist, and a showman, but ultimately he was human. And in his humanity, we find a story that is perhaps even more compelling than the myth of the invincible stylebender. I want to hear from you in the comments below. What was the exact moment you realised that Adesanya era was over? Was it the Strickland knockdown or the Duplessis submission? And who is the next fallen fighter you want us to cover? Don't forget to subscribe to Fallen Fighters for more deep dives into the tragedies and triumphs of the fight game. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next downfall. In the end, the cage is the only place where the truth cannot be hidden. For Israel Adesanya, that truth was a hard pill to swallow, but it was a truth that defined an entire era of mixed martial arts. Whether he returns for one last dance or fades into the history, into books, the Stylebender has left an indelible mark on the sport that can never be erased. Thank you for watching.